So, the Star Wars fandom is known for its reputation. And following with that reputation, there is a slew of fans, content creators, commenters that all like to pretend that the perceived issues with current Star Wars could be solved with one simple solution: the right idea. The sequel trilogy of movies was not well received, but whenever you bring up the idea of new stories to come after the sequel trilogy or stuff that should be expanded upon and developed within the sequel trilogy, people will crawl out of the woodwork and say, well, the sequel trilogy were just a bad idea to begin with. That was the wrong idea. They should have gone with the right idea, and the right idea is never the same. It's either something along the lines of George Lucas's ideas for the sequels, something inspired by Colin Trevorrow's unused idea for the 9th movie, some amalgamation of various EU stories, or flat out someone's very poorly disguised Star Wars fan fiction. Now, the point of this is not to say, oh, critiquing the sequel trilogies is dumb and we shouldn't do it, or suggesting alternative ideas for stories are dumb and we shouldn't do it. There's always merit in critiquing stories, dissecting them, offering alternative ideas, as long as it's done with good faith. But rarely is the solution for storytelling, especially when it comes to something as big and multifaceted with as many moving parts as making a movie, let alone a trilogy, picking and going with the right idea. Brandon Sanderson even kind of echoes this in his latest series of writing lectures, where he talks about how a poorly thought out world with great characters is going to be more entertaining and more enjoyable than a well thought out world with boring characters. But I think when it comes to dismissing this notion that all Star Wars needs to set itself up for success is the right idea comes from Star Wars Rebels. So we're going to be talking about one of my favorite episodes from Star Wars Rebels and one of my least favorite episodes from Star Wars Rebels, and how they both have very similar ideas that are full of high potential, but it's the execution that makes the difference, not the idea. So, first things first, I think it's important to remember that while Rebels is beloved now, and we're seeing a lot of nostalgia, and a lot of characters are making the jump from animation to live action, when the show originally came out, that was not its reputation. Rebels was the Clone Wars killer. It was its replacement. It was Disney's first go at doing an animated Star Wars show since it purchased Lucasfilm and canceled Clone Wars. Not only did it have a different art style, not only did it have a smaller budget, not only did it have a more family-focused approach than Clone Wars, we also got to see and hear about all of the unused ideas for what the last season of Clone Wars would have looked like had Lucasfilm finished it. And let me tell you, the first 2 seasons of Rebels were a hard sell for a lot of Star Wars fans because of, the reputation. So frankly, aside from just getting better at storytelling, learning and growing and understanding their cast of characters better and the direction they want their plot to go in, one of the first big pivots and draws for Rebels in its early progression was just bringing back the Clone Wars. Bringing back characters that had dangling threads, bringing back characters that had unresolved stories, referencing unresolved stories. These were all ways to generate hype and attention for Rebels. And I think this was a good decision for Rebels. It breathed new life into the show, it allowed them to build on stories that they didn't have to spend time establishing. It was cool to see which characters were going to show up and how they'd been changed from their time in the Clone Wars to living under the Empire, and without a doubt, it left lasting impacts on Star Wars in general. So this is our good idea, right? This is our right idea. Let's bring back old Clone Wars characters and slowly wrap up their stories throughout the grand scheme of this Star Wars Rebels adventure. Sounds like a great idea. But a great idea isn't enough, because all we have to do is look at the differences between Twilight of the Apprentice and The Last Battle. Both of these episodes are rooted in the idea of giving sort of a soft epilogue to Clone Wars characters and stories. And yet, they are night and day in terms of how well they actually meaningfully execute this premise. And sure, we can chalk a little of this up to the fact that Twilight of the Apprentice is a season finale, and it's a 2-part episode. I won't deny the very real, stark differences between these 2 episodes. But I still don't think that undercuts my point, because both of these episodes are brimming with potential. One leaned into it, and the other kind of ran away. So let's break down why I think one of these is a crown jewel of Star Wars Rebels, and one of them makes me want to pull my hair out. Twilight of the Apprentice is obsessed with the cycle of teachers and students. And I think it is fully intentional that the apprentice this title references isn't entirely made obvious. It could be Ezra, but it could also be Kanan. It could also be Ahsoka. It could also be Maul. It could also be Vader. They are all of them students in their own right. The point of putting all of these characters in this shared story is to show how that shared experience affects their interactions. Ahsoka running away from her past and the truth is a lesson to Kanan and shows him that he needs to go forward no matter what. That includes when he gets blinded. You see the inverse of that when she confronts Anakin and he doubles down on being Darth Vader. Ezra's uncertainty about his path as a Jedi and the nature of the Force is literally reflected in Maul being the devil on his shoulder. He whispers in his ear like this eerily twisted version of Yoda telling him that maybe the Jedi path isn't the right way. And it's really interesting seeing that because we understand Maul as an apprentice that was discarded, so he is craving that kind of connection that he was denied, this opportunity to recreate that dynamic that he never got to see to completion with Ezra. And the result of having these stories intermingle created a lot of interesting opportunities to explore going forward in Rebels. Ezra and Maul developed a really interesting dynamic that no one ever could have predicted would happen. It set Kanan on his journey of reconciling with his blindness, where he had most of his significant character growth after. Cemented the danger and power of Darth Vader and the Empire, and it gave fuel to the fire of Ezra seeking more and more knowledge, potentially falling to the dark side, and it served as a pretty good epilogue to Ahsoka and her story before we knew she would be coming back. In comparison, The Last Battle does none of this. Despite having no less potential in its setup and the characters that it chooses to involve, because The Last Battle isn't really interested in exploring the potential of its ideas, this episode falls incredibly flat. Truth be told, it already loses points for me because it falls into that Rebels formula of we need to go and get specific supplies and then the Empire shows up, and then in order to escape the Empire we need to use the supplies we were sent to get because we don't really want to change the status quo of our story. Already excusing that, the episode is already so uninterested in its own ideas. And like Twilight of the Apprentice, it has a lot of stuff going for it. While Twilight of the Apprentice brought in characters that helped explore this idea of teachers and their student, The Last Battle is really focused on the fallout of the Clone Wars. And purposely, it does involve characters that have a connection to the original Clone Wars story. Fan favorite clone character Rex, Kanan, who's a survivor of Order 66, and they go out of their way to bring back an old super tactical droid that we saw in a Clone Wars arc, Kalani. And it almost makes a point of showing how messy the Clone Wars was, because it involves 3 parties, all of which were used and ultimately defeated by the Empire, the clones, the Jedi, and the droids. It styles itself as a Clone Wars episode. It uses Clone Wars musical motifs. It even goes to the insane degree of giving Captain Rex auditory hallucinations of the Clone Wars and his fellow clones, and having him call Kanan Cody in a state of delirium. But whereas Twilight of the Apprentice took the pieces that it was playing with, moved those stories along, had them interact and mingle, and then ultimately set them on new, changed directions, The Last Battle uses its time not to further these stories, but to close them off, to wrap them up. Twilight of the Apprentice said, let's take Maul, a character who was discarded and denied the purpose for which he believed his existence depended on, and explore how that hollows him out and changes his interactions with everyone he encounters. Last Battle says, let's take Rex, a character whose purpose for existence was twisted and used for evil ends, and say, what if he just got over it? Kanan has to learn to let go of the past, to move beyond his doubts, to take new steps to build a better future, to reinvent himself as a better Jedi Knight and a better teacher for Ezra. The Last Battle says, what if revisiting a period of that past that shaped him into that person didn't matter? Finally, Last Battle says, what if we point out that the droid army was also used and manipulated and ultimately discarded by Palpatine and the Empire? What if we drop the subtle point that sometimes we're set against each other by forces that want to see us fight so they can advantage themselves? And the only way we can reconcile our differences is to understand that they were inflamed by a third party that doesn't want to see either of us succeed. And do nothing with it. What if we just spell it out, that the droids, the clones, and the Jedi were all used to produce a war that could create an empire, and then have the droids recognize this and leave? So, despite the fact that there was a great idea sitting in this episode, it didn't materialize despite all of its potential. And frankly, I think the only explanation for that is that it didn't want to explore these ideas. It didn't want to explore that potential. The Last Battle was far more focused on being a fun little homage and final send-off to the Clone Wars and all the little fun, quirky instances that happened throughout that show's run. It was a last hurrah that served the dual purpose of also practically explaining that the Clone Wars was a setup by Palpatine to create the Empire. So long story short, that's just how it goes. Potential is cheap. Ideas are cheap. What matters is execution. You can have stories with similar ideas, similar potential, similar stories. But no matter how good the idea is, if the execution, if the focus, if the point of telling this story does not meet up with its potential, it's never going to materialize. I think these two examples perfectly illustrate that. They were both, in their own way, carrying the torch of Clone Wars. They both looked back, saw some stuff that wasn't finished, and decided to bring that into Rebels in a new context, in a new era, and further that story. But one was excited to have its ideas in a new context, and the other was excited to remember its ideas. So there's always potential in ideas. There's always potential in alternatives and different directions, but an idea is only as good as what you do with it. Any one of these ideas could have been a better sequel trilogy. The sequel trilogy could have been a better sequel trilogy if it actually stuck with the potential of its ideas. The point is not that there's a lack of ideas, it is that there's a lack of follow-through. And I don't really know how to end this video, so I'll just say bye. Obviously, let me know your thoughts, comments, and whatnot, and I'll see you in the next one.